Welcome to this week's Tree Lady Talks, where Sharon is going nuts about bats. She's going to speak to Jim Mulholland, and now Jim is somebody that Sharon has known for 20 years. And so for each of those 20 years, she's got a question. But Jim proved to be such an interesting chap that it just was a chat. So if you're nuts about bats, or bats drive you nuts, stick around for the next hour and broaden your mind. Here's Jim Mulholland.
Jim, you're the director of Bats Research and Training. And I've been so looking forward to talking to you because you're a brilliant communicator and such knowledge and passion about bats and trees. But Jim, how did it all start for you?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you, Sharon. Well, I have always been fascinated with living things. And from school, it was all about biology, really. I didn't really know what it was I wanted to specialize in. I just knew I was fascinated by living things. And that led on to reading environmental biology at university. And I met my now wife, Laura, and she was batty about bats. So I have her to blame for all of my bat interest, and kind of followed it ever since. And so we found out early on in our studies at university that there were these things called bat groups, and that bats were protected and you need a license to work with them. So we went off and started volunteering for the bat groups. And essentially the rest is history, really. I didn't really appreciate it at the time. I was so focused on the bats, but I think that's also where my love of trees comes from. So we were studying bats in Savernake Forest in Wiltshire, and a wonderful piece of ancient woodland, and we were surrounded by not only trees, but such incredible trees. So a huge number of ancient veteran oaks and beech trees there. And I had assumed that all ancient woodlands were like that. And it was only when I went elsewhere and kind of got taken to ancient woodland, and I was like, okay, well, where are the big trees? Where are the old trees? And I found out, okay, well, that's not necessarily what ancient woodlands are. These are kind of very different things. But I think being around those trees sparked my interest for trees, and that would kind of later rear its head when I took a bit of a break from bats. I became a bit disillusioned with bats a few years into my career when I was doing surveys, sat outside of a building and thought, is this it now? Is this my life where I'm just going to sit outside of a building and watch bats come out? And I remember very vividly a morning when my alarm went off for a dawn re-entry survey, and I hate getting up in the morning anyway. But the alarm went off at probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, no, I need to go and do something else. And so I thought, well, trees, they're there during the day.
Yeah, they don't move around, thank goodness.
They don't move around that much. And so I thought, okay, well, let's go and study arboriculture, and kind of moved into that field. And I'm now very privileged. I've worked for some fantastic organizations, including the Ancient Tree Forum, the Arboricultural Association. I was a tree officer for a few years as well. And I also, alongside running the training business, I work for an amazing charity at the moment called the Vincent Wildlife Trust, and I'm one of their bat conservation officers there. So I've been very fortunate that I can kind of follow my interests, and also very fortunate that bats and trees, that kind of whole area is hugely interesting to me. And it seems to be an area that's increasingly of interest both to ecologists, but also to arborists as well. And I've enjoyed trying to help cross-pollinate between the two industries.
That's brilliant. I took several things from that. First of all, you described the getting up early in the morning and going to sit, let's say, outside a warehouse or something like that. So I've got some personal experience of that. So I'm not an ecologist, but I used to manage a multidisciplinary environmental consultancy, which had about 7 or 8 ecologists in the end. And I felt as managing director, I needed to metaphorically change the beer barrels. So to have an understanding of how it felt to be a landscape architect, an ecologist, and of course I knew about arboriculture. So I sort of said to the ecologist, I'm going to come out with you and be your sort of eco buddy. You also need on these big surveys, you need somebody who's less trained to stand there with the bat detector. So I did a dusk and a dawn survey, and it gave me a greater understanding of what it's like for the bat ecologists who do such important work. But it's pretty tough. It's antisocial, and it's pretty grueling, and the hours are terrible. And so it's that passion for bats that keeps you going. So I'm glad I had that experience. In fact, my son, when he was starting up his own business, also did a stint of that as well, which also gave him that insight. The other thing is the universe does, or whatever you want to call it, listeners, prompt you when you think, no, this is enough. And I had exactly the same experience myself when I was a local government officer, and I've been doing it off and on for 11 years. And I went to stop in a car park to regroup myself until my next visit. Somebody wanted to make a tree preservation order. Really important work. But I suddenly had this feeling, no, you've got to change. This isn't it. And so I then went on to private practice. And now Noel and I are having some further changes alongside what we're doing. And I think you have to listen to that, because when you listen to that, Jim, as is evident in your life, it leads to greater good. And so what I think is really interesting is this duality you have between the two professions that you've made work. So bats and trees are linked and should be linked. But let's talk about bats in particular, because we have a wonderful wide audience, all sorts of different interests and expertise. Tell us first of all about what type of species do we have in the UK for bats, how many, and could you describe some of the different characteristics?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. So worldwide, there are maybe around 1,500 species of bats, and they make up about a quarter of all mammal species. And in the UK, we're very fortunate to have 18 species of bats. And in my time working with bats, that's increased. And it's fantastic because there's always something new to find out. And so when I first started working with bats, it was 16. Then we found out we had this new species in the UK. It wasn't new to science, but it was so cryptic and so difficult to tell apart from other species of bat that were related to it that you have to look at their teeth. You may measure the length of their forearm to give you an idea of size. And if you had a male bat, you may have to look at the penis as well. So we get kind of quite involved in bat work and look at some very odd things.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I try not to interrupt my guests.
Sure.
I'm interested in this bat penis thing. I mean, it's something that's readily apparent to measure. I'll just leave that there.
So it's more to do with the shape, I guess. And so some bats are very well endowed. And there was a paper published recently about the unique way that serotine bats have sex, and it hadn't been observed before. And if you Google serotine bat sex, you'll find an incredible video about actually how they do it. And but yeah, with the Alcathoe bats, it's about the shape of it. This was the new species that was found fairly recently. And of the 3 cryptic species, 2 of them have very kind of small penises, very narrow, parallel-sided, and then one, the Brandt's bat, has a very bulbous penis, a kind of club shape, so it gets wider at the tip. So we have to look at all sorts of different things to be able to identify the different bat species. Within the same group of that, the 18th species that was added recently is the greater mouse-eared bat. So this is our biggest bat in the UK now. And it's a kind of a bit of a success story, or hopefully will be more of a success story. In nature conservation, often what we are observing are just general declines and things going downwards, and it's doom and gloom and not much to celebrate. However, with the greater mouse-eared bat, it was the last mammal species in the UK to go extinct. That was in 1994. And a few years ago, a bat turned up in a railway tunnel where it hibernates down in Sussex. And it persisted for a few years, and people got quite excited, and then it disappeared for a year, and people got worried and thought, okay, well, maybe it's gone again. And then last year, two of them turned up. And so what are these doing? Are they in the wider landscape? They are part of the Myotis group. And the main way that we know which bat species are around is by recording them on a bat detector. And we listen to the bat echolocation calls, and it would have been the types of things you would have been listening for on your bat survey, Sharon. I forgot to ask, did you find any bats? Did you
Oh,
hear any
yes.
bats?
Yeah, there were pipistrelles
Yep.
and there were some Daurbentons because there was some water nearby.
Very nice indeed. So the Daurbentons is in the same group as the greater mouse-eared bat and the Alcathoe bat that I've just mentioned, but they're very cryptic and very similar calls that they produce. So it's very difficult to tell them apart just with the sound. And so they could be elsewhere in the country. They could be quite widespread, and that's why we didn't know we had the Alcathoe bats, because so many of our surveys rely on bat detectors, but they go and just fly under the radar essentially. So yeah, very exciting times with bat conservation generally. We're seeing a few species increase in numbers. We've got the exciting addition, or kind of re-addition, I guess, of the greater mouse-eared bat, and now going from 1 to 2. And so yeah, lots of interesting things happening in the bat world at the moment.
Could you describe the different sizes? Is the pipistrelle the smallest, or is it the soprano bat? Have I made up the soprano bat? I might have done.
You haven't known? So it's the pipistrelle and then the soprano pipistrelle, or a common pipistrelle and the soprano pipistrelle. And the reason why they're named that way is that, again, they originally were thought to be one species. And it was only in the 1990s, when bat detector technology and DNA technology had evolved sufficiently, that you could go out and record and say, well, okay, well, these bats echolocate at a frequency of 45 kilohertz. But these other ones, which are pipistrelles, are slightly higher. They're 55 kilohertz, and hence the soprano being a higher range of frequencies. So yeah, they're very small bats. They're probably 6 or 7 centimeters long, head to tail. If you remember those old matchboxes with the small
Yes.
matches in them, you could put you wouldn't want to, but you could put a pipistrelle inside one of them. They're that small. And kind of the other end of the spectrum, until we had the greater mouse-eared bats, our biggest bat was a nocturnal bat.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first started with bats and would run bat walks to describe the size of a nocturnal bat, we'd say it's about the size of a Mars bar with a bite taken out of it. But of course, they keep making chocolate bars smaller.
They do. I was going to say that, because when I was a girl and a teenager, I had to have a Mars bar every day. I don't eat them at all now, but they were really quite large, and I saw them in the shop the other day, and I thought, well, surely they're half the size, or I've doubled in size.
They've done it to make it easy for me to refer to the size of a bat.
Oh, okay.
I think that's what it is. Yeah. They used to be really cheap as well. I used to walk home from school and get 3 chocolate bars for £1.
Yes.
You wouldn't get that anymore, would you?
No. I won't talk about how much it cost when I was a child.
So yeah, the size of them, then we have the kind of 3 that are about the size of a Mars bar nowadays, and then the greater mouse-eared bat is just that bit bigger. So it would be our biggest species, but there's only 2 in the country that we are aware of.
How wonderful. And tell us about a year in the life of a bat. Let's start in the spring.
They have a very distinctive annual cycle. So they are one of 3 species groups in the UK that hibernate, the other 2 being dormice and hedgehogs. So in the spring, they will be coming out of hibernation, and they've got a prolonged period of inactivity. And that's due to the fact that there's just no food around. So all of our UK bat species feed on insects. And of course, in the winter months, when it gets cold, food just disappears. So hibernation is essentially a way of managing that and kind of taking advantage of the plentiful times at the end of the summer, and then kind of seeing through winter when there's no food around. So come spring, as the days start to warm up, and even at this time of year, I've seen people commenting recently that end of January, beginning of February, people are seeing bats flying around. So we haven't had much of a cold winter, have we, really? It's been quite mild. So the bats will take advantage, and they will get out and feed whenever they can.
What is it that wakes a bat up? Is it entirely temperature related? Because where they're actually hibernating is completely dark.
Yeah, so we used to think that hibernation was a prolonged sleep, but we now know that that's not the case, that they actually have to wake up periodically to do things such as maybe go out and take on some water, have a wee, to kick their or maintain their internal clock so they know what time of day it is or what time of year, but also things like ensuring that their um, what's it called? Immune system is still active. That if you switch everything off and power down all of the body's systems, then potentially something nasty could come along and kind of cause an infection or something similar within the bat. And so they have this periodic rousing of maybe once a week or once every couple of weeks anyway, where they wake up and just power up those systems and then power back down again. And as we head into spring, yes, it's very much related to temperature and to day length, essentially. And we see some
Mm-hmm.
bats, and it's a bit like thinking about humans with pensions, I guess, that if someone's managed to save up a huge pension, they can kind of retire, can be very comfortable, and they can see out the kind of the rest of the time, not having to work again. Whereas people probably from my generation may not be that comfortable, and so we might have some money saved up, but we might have to go back into work periodically, or maybe work part-time just to kind of keep some money coming in. And it's the same with the bats, that if they've fed up sufficiently in the autumn months, then they can see through the winter and not worry about it. They can wake up in the spring and just kind of carry on then. Whereas if they have got some fat reserves, but maybe not enough, they will have to take advantage of going out and foraging whenever they can, whenever the temperatures warm up enough and there's insects on the wing for them to eat. But come springtime, so late March onwards, we see temperatures rise, we see insect numbers pick up again, and this is linked to the flowering, in particular, of things like goat willow, and other early flowering species that will then attract insects in, and then the bats can take advantage of that. So I was reading a research paper recently where they looked at the activity of Barbastelle bats, one of our truly black species of bat. We don't have many black bats. They're generally kind of shades of brown, but Barbastelle is our one true black bat. And they saw huge amount of activity of Barbastelle bats around goat willows in spring because it was the only food source available that drew in all the insects, and then the bats could come and feed on them. And then as time progresses and it kind of marches through summer, we see the male bats and the female bats differentiate. And so the female bats will congregate together to give birth to their young. And they select warm areas to save on energy, essentially, so they can huddle together a bit like penguins on the ice and save some of that energy. And they want to be in lovely, warm spaces.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because one of the facts I remember from our very keen bat ecologists at that time in my life was that one of the bat ecologists said to me, yeah, bats are really gross. They hold their partner's sperm in their vaginas over winter, and they don't actually become pregnant until spring. Is that true?
Did they use the word gross?
Oh, that was that particular lovely, very talented ecologist. I think that's really clever.
It's amazing, and it's unique to bats.
Yes, I thought it was.
So there are various, I guess, strategies for managing when animals are planning to be pregnant and the best time for them to essentially give birth to their young. So we see something similar in badgers and a few other mammals where they mate, the egg is fertilized by the sperm, and it's just kind of held onto but not implanted straight away. So that's known as delayed implantation.
Okay.
But in bats, what we see is delayed fertilization. So they mate in the autumn months. Generally, the vast majority is in the autumn. We see some occasionally over the winter, and maybe in the spring. But the advantage of mating in the autumn is that's when times are good. There's lots of food around. And if they spend a bit of time trying to find a mate, they can recuperate and build up their fat reserves for any energy that they lose. So they mate, but the the egg isn't fertilized straight away and the sperm is stored separately. And if you think about it, that is incredible. So that
It
is,
is incredible. It is absolutely incredible because obviously humans can't do that. I mean, there's a shelf life, isn't there? So how wonderful. I feel like I want to dive into the detail of that. So the sperm is a living
Mhm.
thing, and yet it's able to also hibernate, I guess, inside a, well, it's not hibernating, isn't it? Is it? It's just being held at the right temperature and is kept still. And then the temperature rises, and I guess they go, come on, lads, we've got a job to do. And then pregnancy happens. Wow.
yeah, so there's two aspects to this. So the first one is it's a foreign body inside of the female
Mm.
bat, and normally the immune system would freak out about that and say, okay, well, we need to get rid of that. So that's managed in the first instance, but then, as you say, it's alive as well, isn't it? Sperm
Mm.
has to be nourished in some way, and so those two things are managed by inside of the female bat's body. And then, all being well, if the female bat makes it through hibernation, she has sufficient energy reserves, she will then ovulate, and at that point then the egg is fertilized. And the huge advantage of that is that they've just come out of this really kind of lean period over hibernation, where they start with fat reserves and they use those and kind of run them down to pretty much nothing. And it means that when they come back out of hibernation, they can focus purely on going out to feed. They don't need to worry about finding a mate and all of the energy
Yeah.
requirements that entails. They just get back out, they start feeding, they reform as a colony again, they find their lovely warm spot, their safe spot to give birth to their young.
So when do they actually give birth? And how long is the gestation period?
It varies in different bat species. So it's somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks for gestation and maybe 3 to 5 weeks, and then until the young is big enough to kind of be weaned and kind of head off on its own. So we typically see bats giving birth beginning of June time, but it depends very much on the weather conditions. So there's a piece of research looking at the effects of rainfall, and rainfall in the spring months, so before the bat is born, that is the single most important factor determining how healthy that young bat will be. And it's so significant that it actually has an impact on whether it will survive that first year of hibernation. So that's the really challenging thing for young bats to do. We lose somewhere up to maybe 50% of bats that are born in any one year, because it's a really challenging thing to be born, to start to learn to fly, to be able to go and feed up sufficiently, to then find a suitable hibernation site, to see themselves through the winter. And so we see such a kind of a huge number of casualties that don't make it all the way through that first winter.
So how many pups does a bat have, and how large are they relative to the bat? And bats are mammals, so presumably they drink milk. I'm the idiot in the corner asking questions, but that's okay because this is a podcast.
Good questions. Good questions. Yes, they are called pups. One of the reasons why bat species were so threatened and why they receive such significant legal protection in the UK is because the fact that they are very slow to reproduce. So if you compare them to mammals of the same size, if you think of mice, for example, they will have multiple litters each year, and within the litter they will have multiple babies. But with bats, the vast majority of species, certainly in the UK, will just have give birth to one young. We occasionally get twins being born, but the kind of norm is to give birth to one. And of course, it takes several years for a female bat to become sexually mature. So she's not going to be giving birth the kind of year following being born, and neither will they breed every year either. And they're very different to mice in that mice were the live fast and die young, the James Dean of the mammal world, whereas the bats are at the other end of the spectrum. And there's kind of documented evidence of a bat in Siberia being somewhere in the region of 48
Wow.
years old as a minimum, they think. And if you think about it, it probably spends more time sleeping, hibernating, than it does awake in Siberia. It's very cold there. There's something that scientists are looking into at the moment, which I think is amazing, but equally terrifying. So bats have these caps on their telomeres, on their DNA. And when DNA is replicated,
Yeah.
it's a bit like a photocopy. You take a photocopy of it, and then if you copy it
Yeah.
again, the quality degrades slightly. And if you copy, that's why we end up with wrinkles and the
Speak for
signs of
yourself,
aging, for
Jim.
example. And
Ah,
they're coming. I can feel the bags under my eyes looking in the mirror recently. So bats have these caps on their DNA that essentially prevent the unwinding of that DNA, which means that they can last much longer and they can age much longer. And so scientists are looking into this to work out, well, can that gene be spliced into human DNA? Which is terrifying, isn't it?
it
I think
is.
I think we perhaps live long enough already.
Gosh. How?
So
Sorry, can I ask a question? Is that unique to bats?
I believe so, yes. I've not heard of it
Wow.
in any other species. And it's an
That's extraordinary.
adaptation for their lifestyle. So it is very unusual for mammals that size to live that long, isn't it? So
It is
normally if you're a
very
small mammal,
unusual.
you breed fast and you die young. But bats are
Yes.
kind of turned that completely on its head. So they breed very slow, just with the one young a year, and then they last for years on years and years. And there's various studies looking into the social interactions of bats, and this is undertaken by marking bats, by a ring being placed on the forearm of bats, and then you can go back to those sites and get to know, well, who's social, who roosts with whom, and how successful are they? Did they give birth this year? Did they give birth last year? And there's studies looking into the fact that the matriarchs, the oldest bats within the colonies, generally are the most successful. And we think there's something there to do with information transfer, that they pass on information to young bats about how to, successfully rear their young, and then find good roost sites, or maybe where to go to mate and find males. And so if we lose those bats, that would have a significant impact on the colony as a whole.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I've spoken about this before. I think that we're at such an exciting time of science with understanding animal behaviour. And we come from everything's recent history of thinking we're the top of the kingdom and animals are below. And now that, fortunately, that is not being considered now. There's more equality. And I think as part of that there was a feeling maybe 50 years ago that animals are a lesser species, they're there to serve us. And of course, we know that's not the case now. But I also think that people have, shall we say, for want of a better word, dumbed down or limited animal species or the living kingdom's intelligence. But because we're only looking at it through our own lens, which I find hugely arrogant. So we're only judging, say, the intelligence or the social intelligence or the creativity of a living species from what we can see and what we can hear, maybe what we can touch. But we have very limited senses compared to, say, a stingray or a seahorse or indeed a bat with echolocation. So quite frankly, who are we to judge? We're just another species, and I rather love the idea of these. Forgive me, I'm not cut this because I can't say anthropomorphogenitus, or was that said correctly?
Anthropomorphize?
So I rather like the image of these matriarchal bats teaching the young mums on how to be, and I think that goes on, but it doesn't look like what we perceive to be communication. It's something perhaps deeper, perhaps something greater. And I think that we are at that exciting time. At the moment, you're looking at tagging and marking and tracking individuals. But I hope that in sort of 10 years' time, that will have moved on even more to a deeper understanding about animal communication. In fact, there's a new book out at the moment on that subject. So carry on about this social interaction between bats, and also talk a bit about their extra sense of echolocation as well, please.
Sure thing. So we left off in the maternity
We
roost
did. We're
where
in the maternity risk, which is round about what sort of time in the calendar in the UK?
we are there largely between June and July.
Yep.
And by the time, if it's been a good year, end of July, it starts dispersing. If it's been a bit of a cold, wet year, it might be slightly later on. And the fascinating thing is, as well, when I say maternity roosts, it depends on what species we're talking about. So we have some species, and perhaps some of our best known species will roost in buildings, and they're very loyal to those sites. So one of the sites I now manage for the Vincent Wildlife Trust has 2,600 greater horseshoe bats in it. So really crammed in there. But when we think about our tree dwelling species, maybe our Barbastelle bat or our Bechstein's bat, they actually move very frequently, and they can use up to somewhere in the region of maybe 50 different roost sites in a year. And it makes it very challenging to find where they are. And so we have spoken about this several times about we have protected species. Our job as either ecologists or arboriculturists are to be aware of those species. And for nesting birds, that's quite straightforward. They sit in one space and they really make themselves known. They sing from the treetops essentially, whereas bats are much more secretive than that. That they're hidden away in the day. They come out at night and they use the sense of echolocation that you've mentioned to find their way around. So they emit these very high frequency calls out into the environment. And if we've got any young listeners, you might be able to just pick up the lower end of those calls. As we get older, our hearing deteriorates slightly, so we lose that top end of our hearing. So I can just about still hear some of the socialization calls because they are much lower down. They're around about 20 kilohertz or so. But the vast majority of all of the other echolocation calls are much, much higher frequency. So all of this is going on around us at nighttime, and we just have no idea because we can't hear it.
How wonderful. And so with the maternity roosts, so for different species, they look different and they may be in a different environment. They're also in different groups. With the ones that go around to different sorts of trees to have their changing maternity roosts, is there any evidence through tagging that they're going along with their mates? You know, is Brenda and Sandra and Karen, are they going from this oak tree one night to a chestnut tree the other night, or haven't we got there yet with research?
We know more about the bats that either roost in buildings or maybe bat boxes, because we can get in and we can see those bats and we can capture them and read the rings. But the ones that roost in trees are the really secretive ones, because first of all, it's a real challenge to find them. But then even if we do, we aren't able to get in the same way and find the ring numbers on the bat. So it's much more challenging. But we do know that there are those relationships where they will socialize with individuals more than others. And the Bechstein's bat that I've mentioned, one of our tree dwelling species, has this fission fusion dynamic where they will aggregate together sometimes and all come together in one space, and then a few days later they will disperse and they break up into a number of smaller groups. And there's perhaps various reasons for this. There could just be the general kind of social things that they get annoyed by some of their cohorts in the roost. And I have a wonderful video from the research that we're undertaking at the moment where we have trail cameras outside of tree roosts of two Bechstein's bats outside of a roost entrance having a fight, having a squabble about something, and they toss and turn, and eventually one of them falls off the branch and presumably flies off and finds somewhere else to roost. So there's probably those general social things that they get annoyed by their cohort. But then I also have videos of species like stoat, so this small mustelid, a bit like a small otter, very, very small otter, up the top of trees and able to climb inside of these cavities. So it makes perfect sense that if they've got these predators in the environment that can get into their roost sites, that they need to be moving frequently. And it perhaps makes sense, instead of all congregate in one space continuously, that the group, the colony as a whole, splits up, and it's putting, more eggs in different baskets then, isn't it? So they can try to avoid that predation.
So it's evolutionary. So that's really interesting. And where are the male bats at this maternity roost time in the calendar? What are they up to?
So we know that they do two main things. So essentially, they can save energy. So they don't need to be warm. They don't need to have their metabolism running like mad all the time. So they can go into kind of small bouts of torpor. So they can kind of power down temporarily. So hibernation is just a long, prolonged period of torpor, but they can go into torpor on a daily basis. So they tend to choose much cooler roosts, and they tend to roost on their own. Not only that, they will choose the less optimal habitat. So they let the females roost and forage in the best habitat, because it's more important that they are able to successfully feed, because they've got young bat to feed. And it's even been shown that male bats will emerge later on an evening to let the female bats get out first and have first pickings of the food. So they're still within the same environment, still within the same habitats, but they're kind of more on the fringe, I guess, and they're just relaxing. They've got no real job to do throughout the summer months. Their time to shine comes as we head more towards kind of August, September, October time. And that's when mating, kind of the vast majority of mating takes place.
Hi everybody, I'm Sarah Dodds, the owner of Tree Law, and I'm a massive fan of Tree Lady Talks.
Going back to the pups being born, Jim, what role does a dad play? Do they have any sense of bonding with the mum and the pup?
None
I
whatsoever.
thought so, yeah.
Yeah, they are completely separate. You may have some juvenile male bats in with the mothers, maybe last year's offspring. So they're not fully mature yet, but when they become mature, they get kicked out by the mothers, we think. So yeah, the males and females very much separate during that kind of busy time.
So when the pups are born and very young, and presumably it's blind and it's got that beautiful velvety fur on, mum has to go out and catch enough prey to make enough milk to feed the baby. How long does it take for the pup to mature enough to learn to fly and catch food on its own?
So you're absolutely right. They're born naked. They can't see at that stage, and it takes a while for them to kind of open their eyes and to grow fur. So you can imagine they're quite susceptible to the cold at that time. So initially, the mums will fly with them attached to their bodies and take them with them where they go, and then they eventually get so big that they can't carry on doing that. So this is one of the benefits of roosting together. And so they can leave them in a creche, essentially. And there's various studies of showing altruism in bats. So essentially, you'll have non-related females looking after the young. There's even a study in vampire bats. So I'm kind of moving off of UK shores at the moment. And so there's a study that shows that vampire bats, obviously famous for drinking blood, but not in the way that most people think. So they don't land on your neck and kind of take blood like vampires do in the movies. They actually land on the floor, predominantly around cattle, maybe around chickens, and they just nip at the heels. And when the blood comes out, there's an anticoagulant in the blood, so the blood flows freely. They just lap it up, just keep drinking away. And because blood is so full of water, they're absolutely stuffed initially, and they're so big they can't actually take off. So they need to have a wee before they can take off. And then they kind of come back to the roost site, and they might find one of their roost mates that hasn't been able to feed successfully. So there's a study showing that non-related bats will actually regurgitate blood to their roost mates And it's kind of shown that that social relationship is beneficial. So if you haven't been successful, you will get food, but it's expected that you reciprocate that when you've had an opportunity to go out and feed. So we see various kind of forms of this altruism within bats, that they share resources, they kind of group together to keep themselves warm, they look after each other's young during this period because it's a very sensitive time. But come 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that, depending on how well the mothers manage to feed. And you mentioned earlier on about them feeding the milk, which is absolutely correct. So they're mammals like us. The young will then be independent enough to go out and feed on their own. And there must be some form of education that they show them how to go and feed, where they feed. And we see a whole range of different strategies in bats. So generally speaking, bats have fairly big ears because it's linked to the echolocation, that they produce these sounds that go out into the environment and then bounce back into their ears. We see some with absolutely huge ears because actually they can just switch off the echolocation entirely and just listen. So there's some amazing footage on David Attenborough's Life of Mammals of a natterer's bat taking a spider out of a cobweb, and also a brown long-eared bat flying next to a moth on a leaf, and the moth is hiding, trying to remain undetected, and eventually it moves its leg, and then the bat can hear it and work out where it is and pick it off. At the other end of the spectrum, we see bats that catch insect in flight. We also see bats that land on the floor, so floors of woodland, and kind of chase around in the leaf litter of woodlands. And so kind of whole range of different techniques. So there must be a way of the mothers showing the young bats how to feed. But then there's also studies of where they tag mother and young bats, and expected that the young would follow the mother and say, okay, well, follow me to this feeding site and I'll show you what to do. And in actual fact, they go completely different directions at the roosts. So there's something going on there. There must be, that we just don't know. So there's always more to learn.
That sounds like universal parenting to me, really. How absolutely fascinating. So let's say we've now got to August and the male bats are thinking, now's my time to shine. What does that look like if you're a male bat?
So there's two main strategies. There is a third, but we know very little about it. So I'll talk about the two main ones. So if people have seen Autumn Watch on the BBC, we quite often see the deer rutting. So they hold a territory, they fight, and they try to attract the females in. So we see a similar approach. It's not called lekking like we see in deer, but essentially with some of our species, including some of our tree-dwelling species, so nocturnal bat is one of these that you will find a fantastic cavity to hibernate in. So he's got a resource, he's got a great pad to kind of hang out over the winter, and he will then sing from that hole. He will also scent mark around that hole, and in the hope to attract female bats to come in and say, okay, look how great this hole is, and if you want to stay here, there's a bit of pressure there, I guess, kind of becomes contingent that they will mate, but essentially it's the male showing that he can find good habitat, that he's a big species, got a good set of lungs on him, he's healthy stock to breed with. So we see that kind of, it's known as resource defense polygamy. So the male will mate with multiple bats, and the female choose them depending on the best male, the best roosting sites, the best song. And in some other bat species, we see them sing, but they don't sing from the roost hole. They actually sing whilst they're flying. So another kind of, anyone who's tried to hold a conversation whilst running is a bit like that, I guess, of demonstrating your fitness, that not only can you fly, but you can sing on the wing as well. So that's one. The other one, which is really quite interesting, and the one that most people are aware of, is promiscuity. So these are essentially a bit like bat discos. So again, linked to where they hibernate. So underground sites generally, caves, mines, maybe abandoned railway tunnels. And the male bats will know, a bit like a nightclub, that the female bats will turn up eventually. So we see male bats flood in at the kind of early end of the season, and they just hang around the entrance because they know at some point the female bats will come and investigate and just check it's still there. Is it still a good place to hibernate? And in the process, then we see this behavior known as autumn swarming. So we get lots of bats just flying around, hundreds, if not thousands of bats at any one location. And that can extend over a period of 2, maybe 3 months every single night. And we think the male bats hang around and they kind of are resident, whereas the female bats may just visit for one night and then go away again once they're sure that the site is there.
You said bat disco. I'm there. Glitter the full works. Oh, it's absolutely genius.
Light up floor.
Yeah, absolutely light up floor. We cannot carry on with our conversation without referencing your backdrop, which is beautiful. So this episode of Tree Lady Talks is actually going to be on YouTube as well, fluffs and all of me saying the wrong thing, because I would like Noel's question of the week to be about your backdrop.
Noel's question of the week. Well, that's convenient because I have actually just arrived. And hi, Jim. I love what's going on here, but I do have a question for you.
Hi.
And basically, obviously, you have your own thing going on with your business.
Okay.
And so is it true that there's only one answer to the question, if somebody wants to know about bats, who they're going to call?
I didn't see that coming, did I?
That's what I want to see, viewers. Those of you who are not actually watching this, I should explain that Jim's got the most magnificent scale model of the Ghostbusters car. Behind him, sirens and lights are working. And if Jim floats around the other way, there's also the scale model of a DeLorean. Now, I'm a bit disappointed, actually, Jim, I've got to be honest, because you've got a DeLorean and you've got a Ghostbuster car.
The two best movie cars of all time. Just pointing that out.
No, honestly, I have to disagree with you, because why haven't you got a Batmobile?
Oh, so despite being into bats, I've never really got on board with Batman. He's not really a superhero, is he? He's just rich. And so I did have a Batman when I was younger. I remember the model. I think it was the Batman Forever car. Who was the Batman then? Michael
Keaton. Yeah.
Keaton. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. The one from the Dark Knight's pretty funky. I don't know if Lego make one of those though. Maybe one day I'll make some space on the shelf if they do. But yeah, without a doubt, these are the two. These are the two kings of the movie world.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. It's great that you've answered my question of the week, and I'll hand you back to her herself. Thanks. Oh no! Wait a minute. News just in. Actually, turns out I've got another question. Have you ever had a bat get caught in your hair?
This is a question my niece asked me recently. So my niece and nephew are currently asking me some questions on my social media about bats. And the first one was, do bats get stuck in your hair? And absolutely not. They have this amazing sense of echolocation. I spoke earlier on about the natterer's bat taking a spider out of a cobweb. The detail these animals can see is incredible. And so I don't know where that comes from. I only ever heard it once I started working with bats. I'd never heard it before that. So they can see you. They can definitely see your hair. I think in all likelihood, where it's come from is probably a disoriented bat, maybe an ill bat, or maybe, as I say to some people, there's probably going to be, just like we have in humans, there's probably going to be stupid bats, right?
I was going to ask you, Jim. Yeah, I wanted to know, because this is actually following on from that really quite nicely. I mean, do bats ever miss insofar as they always fly looking like they're flying at you at the speed of sound? Are there some bats that actually it doesn't work out for?
I'm sure there would be, because if you think about how they echolocate, how they navigate in the dark, the vast majority produce that sound from their mouth. There are some species that echolocate through their nose, so they produce the sound through their nose, and we see this wonderful array of nose leaf that help focus different sounds, and they're kind of designed for different hunting strategies. But for those that echolocate through the mouth, of course, if they're successful in hunting, their mouth is then going to be full of food at some point. And so it kind of makes sense that, okay, well, there's going to be a temporary kind of blind or deaf window, isn't there, whilst they're crunching on the beetle or whatever it is they're eating, until they're able to echolocate again. And so it's inevitable that they're going to collide with things, just like any animal will collide with things, but it's just not the norm, I guess, is the main point.
So we've got to the bat disco in early autumn. And after the bat disco, what happens then?
So this then just leads into hibernation. So there's no firm start of that. It depends very much on the conditions at the time, so the temperature, how much food's available. It will also depend on how successful the bat has been in feeding up, and if they've got lots of fat reserves, then they can go into torpor, into hibernation that little bit earlier. But from the research that I'm currently involved with, where we have cameras up in trees, we're finding bats in the woodlands really quite late on into the year. So the general bat survey season ends at the end of September, and we find bats in October in the trees in the woodlands. We find bats in November, and even one Beckstein's bat where the bat was returning to the roost on the 30th of December.
This week's episode is sponsored by Green Grid Systems. They are innovators in tree protection methods to improve real-life performance, making them practical and easy to implement, protecting root protection areas of trees. Their team likes to be involved early on to make sure that everything works. They've got two main products. The root bridge system, that's something that I've used on one of my sites. This is a low impact bridging system on a base of ground screws that lift the whole thing up. It's porous, it's suitable for paths, parking areas, roads, highway specs. It's very versatile, and it fully complies with the installation method required by BS 5837. The second product is also something I've used, which is Trunk Protector. This is a wraparound canvas timber jacket. It's bright orange with fluorescent stripes, you can't miss it. And what it does, it protects the trunk from accidental buffs and scrapes during construction. It's waterproof, it's hard wearing, and you can use it over and over again. So I'm really glad that Green Grid Systems are sponsoring this episode, and they will be one of the sponsors at our forthcoming conference, more of which at the end of this podcast. You can find out more at greengridsystems.com. So that is a year in the life of a bat, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, and actually has ended up taking most of the interview time, but just a few questions. One of the reasons why bats are so highly studied is because they are under threat. What has been the cause of their decline in numbers?
Just like so many of our wildlife species, bats have been in decline for probably quite a long period of time. So there was a study recently that showed that the genetic diversity of barbastelle bats, one of our tree roosting bats, declined around about the time that England was building its navy and kind of exploring the world, so linked with the fact that lots of trees were being felled from the landscape. But we saw the most pronounced decline, we think, in the last 100 years, following on from the Industrial Revolution, the kind of industrification of agriculture as well. And there's two main issues. So there's the food availability, and then there's the safe roosting sites. So if there's not enough food, then clearly the bats are going to struggle. So we saw intensification of agriculture, the increased use of things like herbicides, pesticides, for example, which are bound to have an effect. We saw increased mechanization. So they went from a landscape with small field sides to hedgerows being ripped out and producing larger fields. We saw changes from even how things like arable farming is undertaken. So instead of stubble being left in the field, which provides overwintering opportunities for insects, that being ripped out, and we saw winter sown crops. And so that general trend essentially has resulted in just less and less food being available. And we, I guess, have seen a bit of an improvement where we had farmers encouraged to farm in a kind of more environmentally sustainable way. And there's lots of people kind of popping up around the country now, kind of really leading on this and trying to restore the landscapes and the huge changes that we've seen. So that's the kind of the food side, just those gradually diminishing. And then on the roosting side, it depends on where the bat roosts. But if you think about trees, if you're going to lose hedgerows, if you're going to lose woodland, you're inevitably going to be losing their roosting sites as well. And these animals I talked about earlier on, sometimes needing up to 50 roost sites so they can find either the right conditions. So maybe one's too warm or one's too cold, or it's too far away from their foraging site, or maybe there's a predator around that they need to move frequently, or perhaps even the decay cavity that they live in was once suitable, but trees are dynamic, so it keeps on decaying, and maybe the entrance gets too big or the cavity becomes unsuitable in a different way. And another big one was with buildings. So the way we construct buildings, we manage buildings has changed dramatically. So we saw various things in the kind of 70s of timber treatment, where bats roosting in buildings were affected either because they were sprayed in the roost with the chemicals, and then when they groomed themselves they ingested it, or maybe they were sprayed when the bats weren't present, but these are such noxious chemicals that the bats came back, rubbed against those, and again ingested them that way. We've seen some being deliberately persecuted. We see things like the renovations of buildings, maybe like barn conversions, changing, a building that was open and available to bats to being converted and no longer suitable. But even down to things like wooden boards being used, or wooden timbers which warp over time in the sun, or maybe degrade when it gets a bit wet, and eventually a small crevice appears or a pocket where the bat can get in and into the roost. That's been changed now, and we cover buildings in UPVC and plastic, and we seal them airtight because we want to make them as energy efficient as possible. So nowadays, if you want roosting opportunities in a building, it has to be deliberately built into it, whereas once upon a time they would have just naturally occurred because of the way they were constructed. So taken together, you take away the food, you take away the roost sites, you're going to have an impact on the populations. And in particular, it's such a significant one for bats, because if you lose a roost site, especially if you lose a colony, so say you were spraying them and that entire colony died or most of it died, it will take years, decades for those numbers to build back up again. But we are seeing it. So the roost I mentioned that I manage for the Vincent Wildlife Trust, currently at 2,600 bats. It was the first ever protected bat roost in the country in 1980, before the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and it was only 200 bats at that time. So fantastic success story, but you can see in 40 years, it's still only kind of improved by a factor of 10 in 40 years. It takes a long time for them to build back up. But that species is a real success story that we knew that its range was across southern England, and then it really contracted pretty much to the southwest only. But a few years ago, one of these animals turned up in Sussex, so showing that the range of this species is re-expanding. So kind of thanks to, in no small part, the fantastic work that the Vincent Wildlife Trust have been doing over the last 40 years, and many other people working with bats to educate or conserve them wherever they find them.
Wow, Jim. We are running out of time, but tell us very briefly about the protection in the UK.
So we see slightly different laws in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland because of the devolved governments there. But essentially, they receive full protection. And in England and Wales, that means that their roosting sites, the places they live, are protected. That's from damage or destruction. The bats themselves are also protected from disturbance and things like capturing and taking as well. So the relevance for people working in arboriculture, for example, or when we go out and whatever it is we're doing, whether it's a risk survey, whether it's a development-led survey, we need to be mindful of the fact that, okay, well, there are a number of bats that use trees. So 14 of our 18 bat species use trees. So we need to be aware of the types of habitats that they use. And so we're thinking of things such as woodpecker holes, decay cavities, hazard beam cracks, other splits and cracks, flaking bark, for example. And of course, these are quite often the ones that prick up our antennae within arboriculture when we're thinking about risk management. And so they're the things that make the tree interesting for the bats, but also potentially cause some concern when we're thinking about how do we manage these trees for safety.
What can we all do so the listeners here who can't help but being enthralled about the life of a bat, what sort of things can we all do to help?
So if people are lucky enough to have a garden at home, we could plant some night flowering plants. So things like honeysuckle is a great one. If you go to the Bat Conservation Trust website, they have a list of night flowering plants that you could plant in your garden. There are a network of local bat groups, so you could find out where your local bat group is, who they are, and go out with them. You could join the Bat Conservation Trust. We're very lucky to have a number of nature conservation organizations in the UK dedicated to not only mammal conservation, but we have one just to bats. So you can go and become a member of the Bat Conservation Trust. And if you want to create some roosting habitats, you can put up a bat box. So you could either go and make one yourself if you're handy, and you can make a fairly basic one known as the Kent Bat Box. If you Google that, you can put one of those together and put it on the side of the house, or you can buy one off the shelf, and again, you put it up on a house or in your garden. Anything along those lines will provide some opportunity for some bats.
Thank you so much, Jim. Well, we live in a medieval building with many roofs, and the bit we're going to work on next doesn't have any bats because we had a bat ecologist do a survey, but we have got bats in the main part of the roof of our house, and we see them flying around in the garden, and I am going to plant some night-scented plants in the garden because we love it.
Fantastic. Which species do you have? Do you know?
Pips. So, and I'm delighted, and I'm not surprised that we have bats. We also have other things in our house, but perhaps we shouldn't talk about on a podcast. Sorry, Noel. You can cut that bit out.
No. I'm going to leave that in. I think that's absolutely,
Yes.
the castle that we live in. I mean,
Some things are living, some things are no longer living, but
some
maybe
other things are
present.
dormant at the moment, which is really good.
Oh, dear.
Yes,
The amount of fur that you've got under your feet, as I well know.
Yes. So finally, Jim, what is your dream scenario?
So I think we need to reach the general public and make them more aware of the importance of bats. And now is a really crucial time. We've just come off the back of the global pandemic, and bats were unfairly and incorrectly kind of scapegoated as part of that problem. The bats weren't the problem. The humans were the problem, as we are for so many things. And I talked about in the UK, all of our bats feed on insects. So if we're out on an evening being bitten by midges, if we had more bats, there's going to be less of that. But also kind of worldwide, they're hugely important to ecosystems. So if you're a fan of tequila, you need bats. If you're a fan of bananas, mangoes, you need bats. They pollinate a huge number of plants, and so many of them just would not exist without bats. So we need to, I think the dream scenario would be kind of the whole world appreciating the importance of this group of species and doing whatever we can to conserve them.
Jim Mulholland, it's been an absolute exciting privilege to talk to you. I am already love bats, and now I'm crazy about them. So Jim, finally, where can people find you on the internet?
So I have fairly active social media channels. So it's Bats Research and Training, or at Bats RTS. If you go to YouTube, I'm at BATRTS as well, and there's various kind of videos and various things on there. And the website is batlicense.co.uk, and license is with a C.
Thank you.
And just before we go, time to tell you about our very exciting new conference in February 2024.
Trees, planning and construction. Is it really working? Do you feel isolated? Well, this conference plans to change that. We're here at BS 5837 Speed Briefing. Biodiversity net gain, what does it mean for trees? And trees and planning law, are you up to date? Sarah Dodd will tell us. Hear from keynote speaker Keith Saker and Jeremy Barrell. We'll hear the views of London Tree Officer John Ryan on what works well and ideas for the future, and a panel of experts, a planning consultant, highway engineer, demolition contractor and building contractor, and I will be saying what works for me. All this and outdoor demonstrations on the 20th of February 2024 here at Braxted Park. And thanks to our headline sponsors, Barcham Trees, we're offering cut price tickets for tree officers. See us at Sharon Hosegood Associates /training or Eventbrite Trees, Planning and Construction.